listening to the Philanthropisms podcast with Rodri Davis. Hello, you're listening to the Philanthropisms podcast. This is the podcast where we try to put philanthropy in context. I'm your host, as ever, Rodri Davis, and this week we have a conversation with Kate Symondson. Now, Kate could be described as a next-generation philanthropist, although, as you'll hear in the interview, Kate would take issue with pretty much every aspect of that and would probably say that the next-gen distinction is not helpful and that she doesn't consider herself a philanthropist, but rather a funder. But she is involved in managing her family foundation, the Symondson Family Foundation. And so I sat down with Kate to talk to her about her experience of philanthropy, her experience of doing philanthropy as a family, and her experience as a next-gen, if that is the right terminology. So we had a really fascinating conversation. I've talked to Kate a few times about these things, and it was great to have a chance to sit down again and to sort of capture that for the podcast. So we talked a bit about how the Family Foundation came about and to what extent that represented an extension of a sort of existing interest in charity and how that had kind of evolved over time. We talked about how decisions are made about what to fund in terms of cause areas and organisations and how that sort of works in practice. We talked about the challenges that come with accepting that as a funder or a philanthropist you have to say no to some things or not to fund them. We talked about how as a funder the Symondson Foundation and Kate in particular tries to manage the tension between making sure that they are open to as wide a range of causes and organisations as possible and aren't getting kind of locked within their own echo chamber or subject to their own biases, but then also at the same time not placing too much of a burden on potential grantees by asking them to make sort of onerous applications and how you do that in practical terms. We also talked about some of the issues around power dynamics once you've decided who to fund and how you kind of manage the relationship between funders and grantees. We also talked about the question of the rewards of giving and whether the fact that it's often argued that giving brings a warm glow to the donor or kind of offers them rewards in other ways, whether that's something to embrace or whether it's actually something that brings a level of discomfort sometimes. We talked a bit about the context of family philanthropy and what it is that Kate had found most rewarding about doing philanthropy as a family and what perhaps had presented more a challenge and some obstacles to be overcome. We talked about the whole question of next-gen philanthropy. We talked about, whether that's actually a helpful terminology at all and whether trying to distinguish next generation philanthropists as some kind of different species from other philanthropists is actually counterproductive and potentially doesn't make sense because it presents them as a sort of homogeneous mass that all thinks alike and also maybe does a disservice to philanthropists who aren't counted as next gen, who actually have been doing philanthropy in interesting ways for a long time. And then we talked a bit about what it was that Kate sort of is most positive about in the world of philanthropy and what makes her most enthused, and also what she thinks are some of the biggest challenges and what are potentially sort of the biggest causes for concern. So without further ado, let's go into the conversation. I really, really enjoyed this one. It's great to talk to Kate, and I hope you'll enjoy it too. And then I will be back at the end for the usual bit of housekeeping. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Kate Symondson. Hi there, Kate.
Hi, Rodri.
Well, it's great to have a chance to talk to you on the podcast. I know we've talked at various points, at length about some really interesting things to do with philanthropy, but it's great to sort of capture that in a way that other people can get a chance to listen in as well. So I guess the best place to start is just for you to say a little bit about what your interest in philanthropy is. You're obviously involved in your own family foundation, but maybe you could kind of explain a bit about that foundation, how it came about, what it is and what it does.
Yeah, absolutely. So my family foundation is about 3.5 years into its life of operating on a more strategic, purposeful basis. it was about 3.5 years ago that we started calling it a foundation. And that's when I came on as head of philanthropy, which at the time I thought, wow, what a cool job title. But little did I know it's going to be quite a fascinating learning journey, and I'm still very much on that journey. My background is in academia, and I'm passionate about research, as well as having written a lot of communications for people working in the social impact sector. So in some ways, those two interests have aligned in this particular role. The foundation is fed by an investment office in a kind of waterfall agreement. So they move a percentage of their net worth on an annual basis. So the pot of money is ever replenishing. So there's not a kind of fear of it running out, which I think was one of the things that held back the family from granting in a more structured and well thought out way. It was much more responsive than proactive before. But with the dawn of COVID and, my goodness, everything else since, the perma crisis, I think we're now living, and it became abundantly clear that it was that we had a moral and ethical responsibility to really engage with that money and grant in a way that was meeting the range of issues that we're presenting. So we focus on the UK, we focus on social issues, but we're actually sector agnostic, and we grant in a much more aims-driven way. So largely speaking, we focus on issues of inequity, and that can be expressed through organisations working to create opportunity where there wasn't opportunity before, to give fairer starts or fresh starts. And then we focus on well-being in all of the senses of the word. And really having that broad focus gives us a wonderful flexibility. It means that unlike quite a lot of funders who have much more clunkier systems and have a lot more red tape surrounding where their funds can go, we can fund in a very intersectional way. I heard someone on a podcast the other day point out that no single person has one single issue. And I do think that when you are a funder who really narrows down to a particular issue, that can really be at the cost of people working in very complex spaces. So that, I think, is a real advantage of being quite a lean, nimble machine, and having very few barriers to what it is we can grant to. But yeah, that's a rough adumbration. And then the other thing I would add is that we aim to fund in underfunded spaces and underfunded communities, again, because so many of the issues in the sector are getting the funding to the brilliant ideas and the brilliant people. That's something that I'm quite passionate about, finding crafty ways of doing that, because there are, as I'm sure you understand, a lot of barriers to people getting funding, particularly if they're minoritized-led groups, community groups, women and girls woefully underfunded, smaller organisations in the early days of their journey. All of these things, I think that's where, as a small foundation ourselves, we can have the most profound impact.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear, and there's lots I want to kind of pick up on about how this works in practice, and sort of what the process is for identifying causes and organisations and decision making, and how that happens. I guess just before I do that, one of the things I wanted to ask, you sort of said there, it's 3.5 years, I think you said, since you've started doing philanthropy in a kind of structured and strategic way, and self-identifying as a foundation. Because obviously, to some extent, the vehicle is a reflection of your own family, and it's partially a sort of family foundational. I know there are kind of other individuals who are also involved. But before you had that structure, was there still any sense of kind of philanthropy being an important part of what your family did, or was it something that you were aware of as you were growing up, even if it wasn't necessarily as structured and formal?
Yes, I think that's an interesting question, because what I would, the ex-English lit academic in me, pick up on is somewhat more semantic. We were charitable as a collective, as individuals. But I would say here's where the departure from charity and philanthropy happens. I think my parents can rightfully call themselves philanthropists now because of the organizational quality of the work, whereas before it was much more to do with coming across something serendipitously and feeling good about giving to, or feeling that it was the right thing to give to it. Or perhaps if something personal has struck you, then you often an emotional response is to give. Whereas this iteration is much more driven by shared values. That's the underpinning of the charity as well, the charitable giving. But it's much more, I suppose, an investment style in its iteration.
Yeah, and that's I want to follow up, but I can't resist at this point, because this question of the relationship or the distinction between charity and philanthropy I find absolutely fascinating. And I wondered, as you have developed more of that sort of strategic approach and something that you can think of as philanthropy as opposed to charity, to what extent has that entirely replaced charity, and to what extent is there still some charity going on? And then I know when I've spoken to other philanthropists, they often say, well, yes, we have all the programs and the strategy and the structures, but we also have, this discretionary pot that we keep, because it's important still to have the ability to do the charitable bit and to be reactive and responsive and to focus on human connection as well. Is that something that's still a part of your overall giving?
Yes, and I really love that distinction, because, gosh, I love it for a whole host of reasons. Yes, there are discretionary funds that we give to our wider family network. We also have a donor matching scheme that we extend to. We have a family farm as well in Lancashire, so we extend to employees there, and also the investment office that feeds the foundation. And one of the reasons that we have those two avenues, and it's a much more ad hoc style of giving, and there are no parameters at all to what you can give to, is that I really find it so important to never narrow my vision so much that, great, I'm an expert in the particular area that we're funding in, but then blind to other issues. So I think it's vital that I have a sense of the charitable landscape that extends beyond the ways in which I grant. But also, I agree, I think maintaining that personable human aspect is such an important check, because hopefully that is always woven into the ways in which we give strategically and philanthropically. We would describe ourselves as trust-based grant makers, but I've actually spent a lot of time recently really hammering out what it is that means, because it can be a very woolly term, right? And it can be used to mislead people, I think. And understandably, a lot of charitable organizations are pretty cynical about funders that are saying, yeah, we're trust-based funders. And they've had such terrible experiences with honestly expressing what they need or what's been a struggle and so on, that it's understandable that you would then live in fear of a punitive culture between funder and grantee. So I think it's important that I am very open about the values that underpin our funding, the pragmatics surrounding how we fund, and really demonstrating what an organisation can expect from having a partnership with us. So hopefully that will be, I'm in the process of creating a new website, and that will be up there, out there. Yeah, because I think having everyone goes into a partnership with mutual expectations, but it's not very often that people talk about them from the fore.
No, absolutely, and I want to get into some of that detail on the how of how you go about grant making and how you sort of take into account all those considerations and what that looks like beyond the initial decision to give over the money and what the relationship with grantees is like. But I guess sort of taking the bit before that, I'm really interested in the question of how, as a family and as an organisation, you identify opportunities to give, both in terms of cause areas and organizations. You said that from your academic background, you're very keen to make sure that it's evidence based. What does it look like in practice for an idea to go from first becoming aware of something through to the foundation funding it?
Yes, that's a good question, and it's one that new philanthropists that I speak to, it's the one question that comes up every single time, particularly the question of how do you find these organizations, especially when you're funding in underfunded spaces. The reason they're underfunded is because of the relative invisibility. And to be frank, I do not have the resources because I am essentially a one-person show that meets with my parents on a 2-monthly basis, actually. And that's for a few hours to discuss strategy and potential granting. So I don't have the resources to accept applications, nor do I want an organisation to speculatively potentially waste time and money and resources in applying. But I am painfully aware of the barrier that then creates to be seen. So there are a number of things that I do to try and circumvent that. One idea wonderfully came from a peer and a friend, Becky from the Helvellyn Foundation. And they have on their website, and I now have the same, a Tell Us About You page. And it's a simple form. And in my case, it populates directly into a spreadsheet that I have access to. And it would take an organisation, 30 seconds to fill out, a little bit about themselves and a little bit about, I suppose, perhaps how they found us, because that might be helpful in understanding their network, and also just what their core aims, their values are. And I consult that spreadsheet on a semi-regular basis. So that's one way. Another way is granting through grant-making charities. It's very important to me that those grant-making charities' values and application processes are akin to mine. So there was one I looked at who had a diabolically complicated application process. So difficult, in fact, that they gave, I think, 3-hour-long training sessions on how to fill it out. That really doesn't align with how it is I go about granting and beginning a relationship with an organisation. Whereas the likes of the Four or Rosa, they have a gorgeously nurturing application process where actually conversations that potential grantees have with the mentors that help them along with the process offer brilliant feedback, constructive feedback, so that even if they don't get through the process, they have this takeaway that will strengthen their application process for the much knottier funders. So funding through them is great because I have a much better sense of the universe of charities that they fund. I may then choose, in addition to granting to these grant-making charities, and I do so in an unrestricted way. So I'm very happy that they spend that on their own core costs. I then readily see all these wonderful, much, much smaller organisations that I would have otherwise potentially been blind to. Another thing that I've recently started doing, that someone I met at a summit in New York recently has devised, is rather than asking your fellow funders, who are you funding? And of course that can be helpful, but you do risk perpetuating one another's blind spots, narrowing of a vision rather than expanding. you should ask your grantees, well, who else should I be funding? Not at the expense of the people that you're currently supporting, but as a value added. And, of course they know the landscape of people doing wonderful, interesting, and possibly even new things out there. So that's just a handful of things that I do. And of course, I go to a lot of conferences and a lot of events, and that can be a fabulous way of discovering even ideas that hadn't even occurred to you, issues that hadn't occurred to you. But yeah, it's something that I ruminate on a lot, is how to be better at finding an organization. And then once you asked about our process, well, once I found someone, it is quite rare I'll invite someone to apply, because unless I really have faith that they do have the time and the resources to do so, I would much rather do high-level due diligence myself, have conversations with them, maybe witness an activity where appropriate, than have them wrangle with an application process that may not be successful. Often when I'm having a conversation with an organisation, I'm pretty much at the point of funding them anyway. So it would be very, very rare that I would let someone down at the last minute. If I do invite someone to apply, it's 4 questions. And really, that's just to get a better sense. I was speaking about expectations of what would be helpful for them. Do they need to employ someone new? Is there a growth strategy? In which case, would incremental funding be helpful? It's all of these things. It's getting to the nitty gritty. And then I fund on a multi-year unrestricted basis, sometimes capital grants if that's more helpful. But again, it's always in line with what works best for that organisation. I like to bear witness to activities, as I say, where appropriate. Sometimes it's really inappropriate, in which case I get to know the team better and to understand what challenges they face. And that means I can be a better champion, because I've borne witness to bared witness to an organisation in action, and that way you can be a real celebrator of their work. I've seen it. I went to a young person's debating final the other day, and there were about 200 teenagers in the room. And oh my days, I could have been in a Taylor Swift concert. They were so engaged and so excited. It was a really beautiful thing to see, and a wonderfully robust contention of the tired lambasting of teenagers that I hear all too often. They are utterly engaged. They are utterly galvanized, and I'm excited that they're the inheritors of this incredibly difficult planet.
I mean, that does sound hugely uplifting, I have to say. So, I was just thinking as you were speaking, it made me think of some of the debate at the moment around what's happened with the trajectory of Mackenzie Scott's giving. Because I know sort of at first she's absolutely lauded for adopting, trust-based approach, core cost funding, not having grant application process for precisely the sort of reasons that you talk about. But then I think the really interesting thing latterly has been a recognition that she and the people around her have had that there are dangers in that as well, in that, as you say, you're then subject to your own blind spots, and you don't know what you don't know. And so she's also added in an element of a grant application process, but then that has the challenge of, you say, there's a huge responsibility not to then just put a burden on organizations if they may not end up getting funding. So I think what you were saying there about trying to find ways of squaring that circle by broadening your perspective by asking other people, grantees or other funders, but then still trying not to place the burden on potential recipients is really, really interesting.
Can I just to add to that, there is no perfect way of funding. It has to be, to my mind, on a case-by-case basis, because one thing does not suit everyone. So I think that's one of the great advantages of heading up excuse me, a family foundation is that we don't have to have these burdensome systems. We're not beholden to, we don't have public money, for example, so we don't have that layer of responsibility and accountability. We can and we ought to take risks because actually that's a learning experience for us. And all too often, some things have to fail or perhaps go on a different path in order to be the more successful version of itself. I mean, God knows you will know this. No PhD ends up resembling what the proposal was.
No.
And I feel genuinely privileged to be in this flexible position. And I do recognise that not everyone's able to do that. But I had a very refreshing conversation with a new philanthropist the other day who's starting out, setting up and running her own family foundation. And I had a delightful email afterwards saying, it is such a relief to learn that it doesn't have to be overly complicated, that I can do this in a flexible way, in a way that suits an organisation, act in a light touch way. But at the same time, my heart sank a bit because it was very clear to me that a lot of the advice she was getting from, for example, wealth managers was to the contrary.
That's something I think is really interesting. I'm sure when we've talked previously, it's something you said that to some extent, absolutely, do have a strategic approach, think this through, have a process, but don't get so caught up in that you become subject to sort of analysis paralysis and don't do anything. Because at the end of the day, the most important thing, particularly when there are some pretty pressing needs out there and the economic situation for lots of organizations is not good, to say the least, the most important thing as a philanthropist is just to get on and do something and then probably iterate and learn as you go along.
Yeah, so it's much better to understand why, to give an example, a charity has no reserves than have an approach whereby you say, oh, they don't have enough reserves, so therefore that doesn't fall into our criteria. Because, my God, there are really sound reasons why a charity in this particular moment will not have a glut of reserves.
Absolutely, yeah. And one of the things is, I wanted to ask, I mean, there's lots of things, and I'm going to apologise at this point that I'm going to start skating all over the place because there's a bunch of things I want to pick up on. But one is, you can make very sort of conscientious, well-informed decisions about giving as a philanthropist and as a sort of family foundation. But the reality is that if you have limited resources, and at the end of the day, all philanthropists, regardless of what level, have limited resources in relation to the scale of the challenges they're trying to address, you do have to make choices, and those choices involve not funding some things. And the reality is, it's not that those things are not good and not worthy and not fundable. You could probably fund almost any of the organizations that apply to you or that you come across. How do you find that, is that something that you struggle with in a way, the idea that you can't do everything and that at some point as a philanthropist you have to make peace with that fact and the fact that you have to make choices and those choices, have kind of opportunity costs in terms of the things that you can't fund?
Yes, I think you do. I would say to be an effective philanthropist, or in my case, a funder, I wouldn't call myself a philanthropist because it's not my money. But to be an effective funder, you have to sit with discomfort. And I think it's really important that you do. So that involves everything from interrogating where the wealth came from and how it's benefited you or me in my case. But also that discomfort applies to the difficult decisions, to the saying no to perfectly good organizations. And I completely understand why a lot of funders will start out much more broad church, a bit like our sector agnostic approach, but will then say, actually, we are only going to focus on education, because then that automatically allows them to say an easy no. But it does, as I mentioned earlier, also mean that you're less able to fund in complicated spaces. So I think the parameters can help funders more, or can risk helping funders more. But there are obviously very sound arguments for, well, actually, if you become really expert in the area of funding education, there can be a strength to that. So I don't dismiss it out of hand, but I do sometimes yearn slightly for a simpler form of funding because it would make those no's a lot easier. I was looking at a charity for about 2 hours the other day that had approached me out of the blue. And I had I suppose, an informed instinct for why it wasn't a good marriage. And I won't go into the details because I don't want to reveal too much about the charity. But the wrestling that has to take place between heart and head, and reminding yourself of strategy and the underpinning values and our drive to fund the underfunded or funding complicated spaces, you have to keep that in check. You have to hold that in order to know that you are making a decision in accordance with that, and not just in a whimsical way, and not just in a sort of in a heartbeat like response. And that is challenging. And as I say, it means sitting with a lot of discomfort.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to come back to some of the stuff around grantmaking in a moment. I think one thing I wanted to pick up on, just 'cause I think it's fascinating, was when you mentioned, that you'd been to that event with those young people involved in debating. And I thought it was a really great example of the fact that as a philanthropist or as a funder who is involved in distributing philanthropic resources, there is a degree of reward. This stuff, I hear it time and time again from donors. They wouldn't do it if it wasn't fulfilling. And it, often there ends up being the thing that they find most fulfilling and gives them the greatest sense of well-being and purpose. I wondered whether, I think because we've talked about this before, I think you were sort of saying something interesting about it, is that something that you kind of embrace about philanthropy, or is there almost a degree of discomfort in a way about the fact that it is actually quite nice and rewarding as a donor? And is there something as a sort of cognitive dissonance when often you're sort of dealing with issues that are themselves, concerning or problematic, or, that you're aware of need out there, and that then, the act of distributing resources to address those, brings with it a sort of warm glow or a reward. And actually sometimes maybe that feels a bit peculiar.
Yeah, it's a good question. So in the list of values and the ways in which we fund that I wrote recently, one of the things that I expressed very clearly in it was we do not fund things where there is an expectation that the funder receives something in return. I really hope that gone are the days of the sort of drunken balls where you have to pay £10,000 for a table and then buy completely unnecessary things at auction have gone. Actually, I saw a charity the other day. They work with issues of domestic violence against women, and they were selling a shooting day for a host of men for fundraising. And I just thought, oh gosh, okay, that still happens. So that's the sort of the extreme end of the reward spectrum. With the softer warm glow, the joy, it's not something that motivates me. It's a fulfilling aspect, but I actually find the exchange of ideas, the commitment to achieving profound and systemic change much more galvanizing and motivational. And I was on a course recently with Forward Global, who were previously the Philanthropy Workshop. And one of the things that you do a deep dive into is what motivates you as a funder. And there's no kind of, there's no judgment in the room for if you said, well, it is the feeling of doing good. But that, given a list of things that motivated me, it ranked very, very low on the list for me, which in some ways comes as a relief because I'm very conscientious about the power imbalance of historic granting, present day granting, and I will continue to reflect on the ways in which I can work to ameliorate that, to correct that. And again, that's another part of the fabric of discomfort of the role, but one to sit with and engage with, not one to run away from.
And that brings us, I think, neatly on to, we talked about the process of identifying causes and organisations and trying to make sure that, the power imbalances that are potentially there in that aspect of philanthropy are kind of minimized. I guess at the point where you begin a funding relationship with an organization, there are then all, as you say, kind of all sorts of other challenges, because there is that natural power imbalance between being the one that has the resources and the one that's in need of those resources. I wondered what you do in terms of trying to address those potential sort of power issues in your funding. And particularly I was thinking, what approach do you take to managing that balance between just placing trust in an organization and having some need to measure the outcomes or the effectiveness of the funding that you're giving to them?
Yes, and that really comes down to a number of things. Obviously, impact assessment is relates to the last part of your question. But I would say the whole funding journey has to actively correct those imbalances. So every single engagement that you have with that organization needs to be an expression of decentering yourself as a funder. So in part, that's through a far less complicated application system. For example, we recently agreed that if an organisation would prefer, very happy for them to submit a video application if that suits them better. We don't only fund charities, we fund organisations working, broadly speaking, in impact. So CICs, for example. They won't necessarily have a dedicated fundraiser, so it's not a language that you're necessarily speaking. And frankly, we don't need to have all the I's and T's crossed and dotted. That's not what we're looking for. We look for potential, passion, good governance, great ideas, people. And so that's a part of relaxing that formalistic expectation. And then it's the nature of the relationship that I established from the start. So a lot, I think, of trust is achieved through conversation, frank conversation. What have the challenges been and how can I help? Not what have the challenges been, oh dear. It's creating a culture of support, not of punishment. And then when it comes to assessing impact, well, NPC are doing excellent work at the moment in trying to establish a system for trust-based grantors, whereby you are measuring impact, but you are doing so in a way that is not onerous or imposing, overly difficult and overly specific systems. So I would say to any funders wanting to interrogate that, do look into the work that NPC are doing. What I'm currently doing in-house, unfortunately, I'm able to, for a period of time, employ someone who is able to create sophisticated data-based models. Not something I'm good at all. And together we're creating an inputting model that is looking at a whole load of criteria across the organisations that we've granted to date. So including looking at our diversity, equality, and inclusion credentials, looking at areas that perhaps we have concentrated particularly in, areas that we might have neglected. That can be geographical, that can be thematic. And really assessing whether we as funders are being impactful. So it's turning the question on yourself. What has our impact been? Not throwing it out onto the grantee. And I'm hopeful that is, again, just going to ever so slightly shift that balance back. Because I think as soon as you start holding yourself accountable, that's where the attention and the focus and the energy should be, rather than asking someone else to do that for you.
Yeah. And that's really interesting. And it made me think, actually, one thing I wanted to ask is, there's a lot of sort of critical narrative around philanthropy, and particularly around the role of foundations. And I think, a lot of good self-questioning and analysis. And some, a lot of that focuses on the need to shift power and resources, not to attach conditions to it, to kind of give more involvement to lived experience and emphasize participation and those sorts of things, all of which I think is absolutely admirable. I guess one of the things that strikes me sometimes is it the logical end conclusion of that sometimes feels as though it's the idea that, essentially the desirable thing would be to decenter funders to the point where they basically didn't exist. And it almost implies that they're a kind of necessary evil because that's where the resources are at the moment. But it'd be better if the resources just, got straight to the organizations on the front line doing the work. I guess my question is that true? Or do you have any sense as a funder that there is some value to funders kind of above and beyond their ability just to distribute financial resources? Do you feel as though you bring something to the table that isn't just the money, due to the position that you hold?
I think you can hold that cynicism, but you can be proactive with it. So what I mean by that is, yes, there is an inherent power imbalance there. Because you are the wealth holder, you are the person giving away funds that you have made probably through a completely inequitable capitalistic system. So therefore, I think that should be galvanizing. If you're operating with a consciousness of that, you say, well, what other value do I have beyond my wealth? Do I have a particular talent that is relevant to this organization? Not just, I think I'm great and I should be running the show. Do I have connections? Could I put them in touch with a trustee who happens to be a lawyer that will help them with X, Y, and Z? Could I become a landlord, for example? Could I be an investor in a property that they, in addition to granting, could I help them buy this property and call that an investment? There are so many things that you can do once you acknowledge that you do hold a degree of power and privilege that is not necessarily held by the grantee or the community that they're supporting. So I think to run away from it actually is potentially wasteful of an opportunity. But, you have to do this in a case-by-case situation. And I would say that, and I'm a real champion of Forward Global, they're an excellent community. And what I would say is they are wonderful at helping people recognize that they might have value beyond just the grant, but also they are great at helping people recognize how that might exacerbate a power imbalance and therefore how to leverage that value in a sympathetic way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. I just wanted to circle back a bit. There's a few different topics here that I'm aware of time already because there's a huge amount of stuff that I wanted to ask you still, but I'm going to try and keep it brief. I guess one that I'm really interested in is just coming back to the sort of specific context around family philanthropy. I guess I always find it fascinating because obviously we all have families and we're all sort of, aware. I try and put myself in the position of thinking if I was in the position to have resources and have to make these sorts of decisions and not just, pontificate about them, what would it be like? And I guess it's fascinating because I guess what I wanted to ask is there must be aspects of it that you've found work really well and kind of, are really rewarding and actually, as an activity to share as a family, philanthropy is a wonderful thing. And inevitably there will be bits of it that present challenges. I guess what have you found so far in terms of the bits that have surprised you and you've thought, wow, this is, I wouldn't have thought this, but this has been hugely positive. And where have you found that you've had to kind of navigate a few bits and pieces, which inevitably will be the case?
Yeah, and of course it will be the case because we're all very different personalities. We all have very different professional experiences. In many ways, both of those things are a real strength because it's very helpful to have an antagonist, a challenger in the room, because for one, it allows you to really hone your understanding of a situation. And also find a language to express and persuade in a robust way. And to also acknowledge that at times you may well need that separate perspective. You may need that check and that balance. I've been absolutely delighted with the open-hearted ways in which, particularly my parents, who I work with most closely on this, have embraced the trust-based model. They utterly get that granting to core costs is essential. They've never questioned it on a multi-year basis, ongoing basis. And And I really I feel such pride when I see them championing that form of grant making to other people. That's a very special thing that we share together. I suppose one of the things that I have found challenging, but I have a new strategy for overcoming, is leveraging the foundation's funds for investment for impact alongside of granting. Now, I really respect why it is there's a suspicion surrounding that. My family are a family of investors, and investors in quite a traditional sense. Impact investment for many is new. There is also a real tendency, and I see this everywhere, to conflate it with ESG. And I think ESG has, for many, become somewhat of a crowded space. It's also a term that's bandied around in ways that are wholly inaccurate of where the money is actually held. It was shocking to me how many ESG investors invested in oil directly after Ukraine was invaded, similarly with grain. Impact investing is not ESG. Impact investing is one step further. It is an expression of the fact that whilst charities are utterly necessary, they are a flawed model. To endlessly have to fundraise is a serious problem. And so an issue of sustainability is embedded in the structure of charity. So to invest for impact is to work with the capitalistic systems that have caused so many problems and hopefully achieve some sort of systemic correction. I myself intimated that I have a new strategy, and that is, whilst we are not currently treading that path with the foundation, but I hope very much that we will down the line. And to be clear, any investments that have been made on the investment side are thoroughly interrogated on an ethical basis. But I, with my much more modest funds, have joined an investment for impact syndicate, and am direct investing in that way with personal funds, partly to learn, partly to be a part of that community. And I also hold funds with a wealth manager that invests for impact. So I'm trying to put my money where my mouth is. And I think it's important to align one's personal life with one's grant-making professional life. For me, anyway, there are too many instances that are readily citable of grant-making practices really not aligning with investment practices and vice versa, or worse still, one being used to be a salve for the ills of the other one. So that is one of the tensions I've come up against. But again, I respect the fact that they are investors, and I'm not. I've got degrees in English literature. That's not my language, but I do love learning.
One thing I really wanted to ask you actually is, you are obviously an example, and at this point I'm going to make you a representative of a phenomenon in philanthropy that a lot of people are talking about all the time, which is next gen philanthropy. I think particularly because there is this sense that we're on the cusp of this enormous intergenerational wealth transfer, and so there's a huge amount of extemporizing about who these people are, what interests them, what drives them. Are they going to be totally different in their approach? First of all, do you think it's helpful to talk about next-gen philanthropy as if it's some sort of distinct phenomena? And do you have a sense, from your own experience and from kind of your experience of talking to other sort of younger philanthropists in a similar position, whether they do hold slightly different or distinct attitudes towards philanthropy, and whether they're doing things in different ways from previous generations of philanthropists?
No, I don't think it's a helpful distinction at all. I think it's one of the many wicked ways in which we're just creating two camps, which we just seem to be interminably in the habit of doing across all issues. For one, it's hugely disrespectful to an older generation that are being utterly pioneering in the sphere of trust-based grant making and impact investment, and frankly are inspirational to me and to many of my peers. It also creates friction where there needn't be. As I say, there can be very helpful challenges. I was actually speaking with some grant making peers about this very thing last night, and I think what we all share is that yes, there are differences in ways of doing. I tend to speak about it more in terms of a traditional approach that leans a bit more towards a paternalistic approach versus a progressive and somewhat more radical approach. But it's not necessarily intergenerational, and I think with this extraordinary situation of funds being moved between generations, there really needs to be collaboration and understanding and open-hearted conversations, and not a sort of warring faction of two camps. Just to add to that, I heard an extraordinary thing last night. Apparently people have started talking about G1s and G2s and, and apparently a system of ranking generations. I don't think we need to move in that direction myself.
No, I'm not sure it's helpful. I mean, I particularly, I guess, because I have a sort of pathological aversion to this sort of neophilia in philanthropy, which is just, X is entirely new. This is the new thing in philanthropy. This is a new trend. And I kind of constantly think, I guess because I spend so much time boring people about the history of philanthropy, I find myself constantly saying, no, it's not new. It's interesting, but it's not new. And I think that's very much, the case with all of the different characteristics that are put forward as sort of unique and distinctive about next gen philanthropists. I sort of feel, well, no, they're, yes, there might be trends and, kind of differences of emphasis, but philanthropy is to some extent philanthropy, and it's quite cyclical. There's a whole bunch of bigger picture questions that I had down, which I would absolutely love to talk to you about, but I think that would take us on an entire other hour of podcast, so I won't do that. I guess just as a final, closer, I'm going to try and lump some of those together in an open-ended way and say, when it comes to philanthropy, what is it at the moment that kind of gives you most optimism or makes you most positive about its potential as a force in society? And what is it that gives you most sort of cause for concern or makes you think that there are particular critiques of it that are, valid and important and challenging?
I think the thing that has me most excited about it is that increasingly in the more radical progressive end of philanthropy, I'm seeing people really galvanizing and working together in ways that extend far beyond philanthropy. So creating a whole kaleidoscope of impact with the privilege and power that you hold, and recognizing that philanthropy is but an expression of a much more holistic intention. So I think it's very important that we collectively move towards thinking about the big picture of how we can achieve systemic change and move towards a sustainable climate, and also overcome social inequities. So the joined up thinking is really exciting, and the communities that are being built in relation to that are an absolute joy to be a part of, and a real salve for the dysfunctions of government and badly spent public money. I think one thing that has me somewhat worried is trying to marry that vision with the powers that be. How do we get to the point of collaboration when actually the powers that be stand to benefit more from the status quo remaining? So that is a big question that I keep coming back to. I actually run a course on the art of protest, and interestingly, for activism to be successful, ultimately, yes, you have the disruptive action to begin with. That's part of making an issue visible, grabbing the attention of the authorities. But that's not largely what affects the change itself. The change tends to come with much more covert and quiet collaboration. And that is the point that I'm more anxious about. With the disruption is there, I see it, but I've not yet seen the hand holding, not in the Western world anyway.
It's really interesting. It makes me think of some of the things Rebecca Solnit's written about, kind of in praise of slow change, and the fact that you get those moments of very fast change only because people have spent so long doing all of the hard legwork up to that point, and then suddenly you get a tipping point. But it looks like it's just happened out of nowhere. Again, that could be the topic for an entire other hour's conversation, so maybe we should come back and talk about that at a different point.
But to be a bit sycophantic for a moment, Rodri, this is why the work that you do is something that I absolutely love, because as you say, that there are cycles in philanthropic giving and the power it has to affect change. And it's understanding those that help provide a model for the present day. So I genuinely love reading your work.
Oh, well, thank you, Kate. That's very kind of you, although I may well choose to edit that out because it's sort of, I'm too British to accept that sort of praise. But it just remains to say thanks ever so much for coming on the podcast. It's absolute delight to get a chance to talk, as ever. I'll put links in the show notes to places where people can find all sorts of stuff that's relevant to what we've talked about. I should say I've left an enormous amount in the locker in terms of other things that we could talk about. So at some point, I will almost certainly nag you again to come on and have another conversation where we can do part 2 of this.
That sounds great.
Great. Okay, well, my thanks again to Kate for finding the time to come on the podcast. As I said in the interview, there's absolutely loads that I could have asked Kate about, which I didn't get around to, so I absolutely will do my best to drag her back on the podcast at some point in the future so we can continue the conversation. In the meantime, I will put links in the show notes to places where you can find relevant bits of writing and other sort of content that touches on the issues that Kate and I discussed. If you're interested generally in issues around philanthropy and civil society, do check out the website at whyphilanthropymatters.com. You can find all the back issues of this podcast. You can find lots of articles, short guides to topics in philanthropy, updates on things I've been doing, and a whole bunch more. If you want to follow me on social media, the best place probably these days is LinkedIn. I'm posting on there fairly regularly. If you've got ideas for topics we could talk about on the podcast or people I could interview, I genuinely do mean it, that please get in touch. That has led to quite a few of the episodes that you've heard. So, it really does make a difference. If you know anybody that you think might like the podcast, please do let them know about it. I think, personal recommendation goes a long way with these things. Other than that, just subscribe or follow, and I will see you next time. Bye!